The sky over the Pacific Ocean tore open. It was not a natural phenomenon. There was no storm, no scientific explanation that any satellite or sensor could initially provide. One moment, the sky was a clear dome of blue. The next, vast, shimmering ripples spread out from a dozen points, like stones dropped into the pond of the atmosphere. From these ripples, ships emerged. They were not sleek human vessels. They were blocky, brutalist things the color of tarnished silver, each one the size of a mountain range, hanging in the silence of space with a menacing indifference on Earth. Panic was instant and total. The global early warning network, built for asteroids or a single hostile probe, screamed in overload.
12 identical contact.
They were not answering hails. They simply moved into high orbit and began to disgorge their cargo. From the underbellies of the Titanic ships, smaller shapes fell. Not missiles, but countless pods, modules, and ragged chunks of material. They burned through the atmosphere in a rain of fire that looked, from the ground, like the end of the world. But when the smoke trails faded and the debris hit the water, the truth became horrifyingly clear. It was not an attack. It was a delivery to a secure bunker beneath Geneva. Jin-Ho Kim stared at the main display, his coffee cold and forgotten. The room buzzed with frantic voices in a dozen languages, but he heard only the hammering of his own heart. The images on the screen were incomprehensible. The pods that survived the descent were not opening. They were dissolving, melting away in the seawater to reveal people, or something like people. They were humanoid, with slender limbs and large, dark eyes, but their skin had a faint, pearlescent sheen, and they seemed to move through the choppy waves with an instinctive, desperate grace. They wore tattered, simple clothing. They clutched each other. They clung to floating wreckage. Thousands of them, then hundreds of thousands. The numbers on a secondary screen spun upward, a digital counter of despair. Confirmation from the Tokyo and Honolulu observatories, a voice said, hollow with shock. The objects are living beings. They are being deposited primarily in marine environments. The North Pacific, the Sea of Japan, the Atlantic coasts. A terrible, cold transmission pierced all communications channels. The image that resolved on screen was an alien face, austere and hairless, with eyes like chips of gray slate. It spoke in perfectly synthesized English, its tone devoid of any emotion. People of Earth, you have been observed. In your infant explorations, you displayed a nascent, untested empathy. A weakness. The alien, who would later be known only as the Overseer, continued. The species you see before you are the Salem. They rebelled against the order of the galactic hegemony. Their punishment is dispersal. Their homeworld is glass. Their population core is to be scattered among pre-emergent cultures, to be a weight upon your resources and a test of your character. 6 million units have been delivered to your biosphere. You showed compassion. Now let it be your anchor. Let their care fracture your world and end your ascent before it truly begins. This is retribution. For them. And for you. The transmission cut. The silence in the bunker was absolute. Then chaos erupted. Arguments exploded about sovereignty, about military response, about planetary quarantine. Words like burden and threat and impossible flew around the room. Jin-Ho did not shout. He was a mid-level coordinator for the United Earth Refugee Relocation Agency, a man who dealt in dry reports and funding allocations for displaced persons camps. He was used to crises, but on a human scale, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, never millions, and never from the stars. His eyes remained glued to the live feed from a South Korean coastal patrol drone. It showed a scene from the coastline near Busan. The water was thick with struggling figures. The Salem were coming ashore, not as invaders, but as the drowned and the dying. They crawled onto the sand and rocks, collapsing from exhaustion, confusion, and fear. Children, or what he assumed were children, wailed with a soft, chirping sound. Adults tried to shield them, their large eyes scanning the unfamiliar landscape of buildings and trees with terror. On the beach, a different scene unfolded. The local police had formed a hesitant, nervous line, but pushing past them came ordinary people, fishermen in their waders, Shopkeepers, elderly women. They were not armed. They carried towels, bottles of water, and blankets. A young woman with her hair tied back in a practical ponytail was at the forefront. Her name was Sumin Park. Just hours ago, she had been a community organizer planning a neighborhood cleanup. Now, she walked straight towards the bedraggled, shivering aliens. She stopped a few meters away, knelt in the wet sand, and placed her bottle of water and a wrapped bar of rice cake on the ground. Then she slowly backed away, her hands open and empty. One of the Salem, an older male with a faded pattern on his tunic, stared at her, then at the offering. With trembling hands, he reached out, took the water, and gave it to a smaller Salem beside him. The act was simple. It was basic. It was the first step. Jin-ho watched this tiny, profound moment of grace amidst the cosmic cruelty. The politicians and generals in the room with him were talking about blockades, about containment zones, about the astronomical cost. But on a beach in Busan, the decision had already been made. It was not a decision of policy, but of instinct. He finally looked away from the screen and picked up his secure tablet. His hands were steady now. The scale was impossible. The logistics were a nightmare. The future was terrifying. But the path was suddenly clear. They had been given a choice, framed as a punishment. Abandon compassion or let it break you. Jin-ho opened a blank action plan template. He knew, looking at the face of Sumin on the screen and the grateful, frightened eyes of the Salem, that humanity would have to find a third option. The work, the impossible work, began now. He started to type. The world held its breath. The initial shock of the arrival was replaced by a heavy, global dread. 6 million was not just a number. It was a tidal wave of need that threatened to drown coastlines and governments. In the days that followed, the true scale of the crisis became clear. The Salem were not soldiers. They were families, artisans, scholars, and children. They were completely unprepared for Earth. Their amphibious biology needed regular contact with water, but salt water was not enough. They required specific minerals and a stable temperature range. Without it, they grew sickly, their pearlescent skin becoming dull and cracked. News channels showed chaotic scenes. Camps of makeshift shelters made from driftwood and salvaged pod material sprang up on beaches from Chile to Indonesia. The Salem huddled together, their quiet chirping cries a constant, sad soundtrack. They did not understand the languages shouted through megaphones. They only understood that they were lost. The global response was a mess of fear and hesitation. Some nations, citing security and economic collapse, declared immediate no-approach zones. Naval ships were deployed not to rescue, but to contain. The rhetoric from certain leaders was cold. "This is not our problem," they said. "This was an act of war by the hegemony. We cannot bankrupt our people for an alien mistake." Jin-ho sat through endless video conferences. His plan, a simple framework for temporary shelter and registration, was buried under committees. "The cost per head is unsustainable," a finance minister argued. "Where is the food coming from?" demanded another. "What diseases do they carry?" asked a health official. The questions were valid, but the tone was of rejection. Jin-ho felt a cold knot of despair in his stomach. The overseer's plan was working perfectly. But on the ground, a different story was being written, one person at a time. In Busan, Sumin was running on little sleep and fierce determination. The act of offering water that first day had drawn others to her. Soon, she was coordinating a dozen volunteers, then 100. They were not an official organization. They were fishermen, students, grandmothers, and shop owners. They faced huge problems. The Salem were afraid of enclosed buildings. Sumin's group set up large open tents on the pier, allowing the sea air to flow through. They learned that certain local seaweeds, when boiled, made a broth the Salem could digest. Fishermen diverted their catches, not for market, but for the soup kitchens that now lined the harbor. Sumin worked side by side with an older man named Captain On. He was a retired naval officer, his face lined from years of sea wind. When the government order came to keep the Salem in the water on humanitarian hold, Captain On had looked at it, grunted, and then picked up his radio. Within hours, he had mobilized a fleet. Not warships, but old ferries, fishing trawlers, and even recreational boats. They formed a ragged but effective floating platform a kilometer offshore. It was a barrier against the worst of the waves and a place to bring supplies. The sea is their home, but they are drowning in it, Captain On said to Sumin, his voice gravelly. We will meet them halfway. On the third day, a new problem arose. A young Salem child was found shivering violently, its skin turning a worrying blue. The local hospitals were overwhelmed and unsure. Sumin carried the child herself to a small veterinary clinic run by an old friend, Minjae. The vet, terrified but professional, examined the child. He had no reference, but he had decades of experience with sick animals. He is too cold, Minjae said. But not like a human. His body is losing moisture and heat at the same time. He improvised. He filled a shallow tub with warm water and added a specific mineral salt used for tropical fish. They carefully placed the child in it. Within minutes, the shivering stopped, and a faint, healthy sheen returned to its skin. It was a small victory, but it spread like wildfire through volunteer networks. A simple recipe for life water was shared across the globe. Jin Ho, watching from Geneva, saw these reports trickle in through non-official channels. He saw the photo of the Salem child in the vet's tub, cradled by Sumin. He read Captain On's blunt, operational logs from the floating platform. This was not a top-down rescue. It was a ground-up uprising of basic human decency. He made a decision. He bypassed the stalled committees. Using his authority, he declared the Busan operation a Phase 1 humanitarian pilot zone. It was a bureaucratic term that meant almost nothing, but it allowed him to funnel emergency funds directly to the city's disaster relief fund, which was now being used for seaweed and mineral salts. He then did something else. He opened a public data channel, linking every community group like Sumin's that he could find. He shared the life water formula. He shared designs for open-air shelters. He connected an engineer in the Netherlands who had designed a simple water filter with a group in Bangladesh struggling with freshwater needs. The machine of government was stuck, but a network of people, connected by compassion and desperation, was starting to move. It was messy, inefficient, and emotional, but it was working. On the screens in the bunker, the red zones of crisis began to show small, stubborn patches of green. They were not saving 6 million yet. But in Busan and in 100 other places, they were saving the ones in front of them. And for now, that had to be enough. The initial wave of adrenaline-fueled help could not last. Blankets and hot broth addressed the first shock, but 6 million beings needed a system. The world teetered on the edge of a terrible choice. Organize a massive, structured response, or watch the compassionate efforts of volunteers collapse under the weight of endless need. Jin Ho lived in his Geneva office. The Busan Pilot Zone was a label he had created out of thin air, and now he had to make it real. The political opposition was fierce. You are creating a precedent, an ambassador from a powerful nation argued during a closed session. You are telling the galaxy that Earth is a dumping ground. We must show strength, not weakness. Containment is the only language they understand. But Jin Ho had data now. He had numbers from Busan. The number of Salem needing critical medical care was dropping thanks to the life water protocols. The volunteer networks, while strained, were distributing food with surprising efficiency. The crisis was stabilizing in small pockets. He needed to replicate that, not with more committees but with tools. His masterstroke was bureaucratic, and he knew it was deeply unglamorous. He dug up an old, nearly forgotten framework, the Cross-Border Disaster Person Protocol. It was a dry document created for earthquakes or tsunamis, allowing for the temporary waiver of visa and entry requirements for displaced persons. It had never contemplated aliens. With a small team of loyal legal aides, he rewrote it. He called it the Temporary Planetary Protection Status. It granted any Salem basic rights to food, water, shelter, and medical care, but no permanent citizenship or land rights. It was a holding pattern, a document that said, "You are not a threat, and we will not let you die, for now." It was the bare minimum of mercy, codified into law. He did not ask for a vote. He knew he would lose. Instead, he used a loophole. During a declared planetary emergency, which this certainly was, the United Earth Relief Directorate had the power to enact temporary protocols for a period of 72 hours. He enacted it and sent the notification at 3 in the morning, Geneva time. By breakfast, the world's governments were in an uproar. But the order was in effect. And on the ground, it changed everything. A doctor in San Francisco could now treat a sick Salem child without fear of legal repercussions. A construction company in Thailand could legally donate materials to build open-air shelters. The invisible wall of maybe we shouldn't began to crumble in Busan. Sumin felt the change immediately. Red tape evaporated. She could now officially requisition bulk supplies of the mineral salts from a chemical company. Captain On's floating platform was no longer a rebellious act. It was a legally sanctioned, offshore receiving and stabilization point. Volunteers wore newly printed badges, their efforts legitimized. The work became harder, but more focused. It was no longer just about saving lives hour by hour. It was about building a life for the next week and the week after. Engineers arrived, looking at the Salem's natural affinity for water. They worked with Salem elders using gesture and drawing to understand their needs. They learned the Salem could not sleep on dry beds. They needed resting pools of shallow, circulating water. Simple, modular pool units made from repurposed shipping containers began to be fabricated in shipyards up and down the coast. They were not beautiful, but they worked. Food was a bigger puzzle. The Salem digestive system was delicate. Human food was often poisonous to them, but they thrived on certain types of kelp and algae. An agricultural scientist, Dr. Lee, set up a makeshift lab in a Busan warehouse. She worked with a Salem who seemed to have a knowledge of plants. A male the volunteers called Teacher. He would point to images of local seaweeds on a tablet, nodding or shaking his head. Through trial and error, they identified 3 species that were both nutritious and easy to cultivate in the cool coastal waters. Dr. Lee called it Salem kelp. She developed a fast-growth aquafarming technique. Soon, former fishing boats, their nets stored away, were being converted into small-scale kelp farms. The Salem themselves took to the work naturally, tending the underwater lines with a gentle, knowing touch. It was the first spark of something beyond survival. It was purpose. Jinho monitored all this from 1,000 data streams. He saw the first harvest reports from the kelp farms. He saw the falling numbers from disease outbreaks. He saw the volunteer hours plateau and then slowly decrease as some Salem began to do tasks for themselves. It was not victory. It was fragile, exhausting, and incredibly expensive. Protests still happened in cities far from the coasts, people angry about resources being spent on aliens. There were tense moments in the camps, misunderstandings that led to fear. But the machine of mercy was now built. It was made of repurposed fishing boats, shipping container pools, kelp lines, and a temporary legal status invented by a tired bureaucrat. It was powered by the stubborn kindness of people like Sumin and Captain On, and the quiet resilience of the Salem like Teacher. The overseer's punishment had been a boulder dropped into Earth's pond. The first response had been the splash of panic. Now, the ripples were becoming organized waves of action, spreading out from countless points of light. They were not drowning. They were learning to swim together in very deep water. A strange quiet settled over the Busan integration zone after the first frantic months. The emergency was not over, but the chaos was. The Salem had shelter, food, and medical care. They were alive. But as Sumin walked through the sprawling, orderly community of open-sided tents and container pools, she felt a new kind of weight in the air. It was the weight of silence, of empty hours, of grief with no outlet. The Salem moved through their days with a listless obedience. They ate the kelp broth. They rested in their pools. They helped with basic tasks when asked. But their large, dark eyes held a distant, hollow look. They were not building a life. They were waiting in a holding pattern between a lost past and a future that did not exist. The children did not play. The adults did not create. They simply endured. Sumin mentioned this to Captain On one evening as they watched the sunset from the pier. "We saved their bodies," she said, her voice tired. "But I think their spirits are still out there, drowning." Captain On nodded. gazing at the floating platform where Salem sat staring at the water. "A ship with no course will drift until it hits rocks," he said. "They need a purpose. We all do." The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. Sumin often spent time with the Salem elder they called teacher. They had developed a basic way of communicating through a tablet with a drawing program and a growing library of pictures. One day, she was trying to explain the concept of a school. She drew simple figures of Salem children and a building. Teacher watched, then gently took the tablet. He did not draw a building. He drew a complex, beautiful spiral pattern. He pointed to the ocean, then to the spiral, then to his own temple. He repeated this several times. Sumin did not understand. Later that week, a problem arose with the water pumps that circulated seawater through the resting pools. A young engineer, Ji-hoon, was struggling with a clogged filter system. Teacher observed him for a long time. Then, he walked to the edge of the pool, knelt, and began to move his hand through the water in a slow, specific rhythm. He pointed to the intake pipe, then made a swirling motion with his fingers, mimicking the removal of debris. Ji-hoon, frowning, adjusted the pump's flow rate to match the rhythm teacher had demonstrated. Almost immediately, the clog cleared, and the water flowed smoothly. Ji-hoon stared, then laughed in surprise. Teacher gave a slow, solemn nod. It was not magic. It was applied science from a different world. Teacher understood fluid dynamics in an intuitive, lived way that human engineers learned from textbooks. Sumin saw the spark in teacher's eyes for the first time, a spark of usefulness. She organized a meeting. She brought together a handful of engineers and scientists with a group of Salem elders, including teacher. It was awkward at first, but she started with the pump story. Ji-hoon showed diagrams on his laptop. Teacher, in response, used colored sand on a flat stone to draw flowing, intricate patterns of currents and eddies. He was not just fixing a pump, he was explaining a philosophy of how water moved. Dr. Lee, the kelp scientist, was fascinated. She showed teacher images of her aquafarming setup, where kelp grew on long lines in the current. Teacher studied them, then drew over the images with a light pen. He suggested a subtle change in the spacing and depth of the lines, aligning them with the dominant subsurface current patterns he seemed to sense. "He says it will let the plants sing better," Sumin translated, unsure. Dr. Lee decided to test it on one small plot. The results were not subtle. The kelp in the realigned plot grew 20% thicker and faster. It was healthier. Teacher had not just known about water. He knew about the life within it. Jin-ho, receiving these reports in Geneva, felt a jolt of electricity. He had been fighting to justify the cost of the operation, arguing it was a moral duty. Now he had a new argument. He called it the Reciprocal Integration Initiative. It was not about humans giving and Salem receiving. It was an exchange. He approved a small budget for a formal knowledge exchange program in Busan. It started simply. Human engineers would teach basic construction and solar power principles. In return, Salem elders would consult on any project involving water, irrigation for nearby farms, the design of a new seawall, even the cooling systems for a local power plant. The change in the camp was slow but profound. The Salem were not being treated as victims anymore. They were being treated as experts. Their shoulders straightened. They began to initiate conversations, pointing to systems they thought could be improved. The children, watching their elders contribute, started to mimic them, building small, intricate sand models of water systems on the beach. Sumin found teacher one evening drawing in the sand under the light of a string of bulbs. It was a vast, beautiful map of the bay with lines showing currents, temperature layers, and seasonal changes. A small group of human and Salem children watched, mesmerized. "He is not just teaching us about water," Sumin said to Captain On, who stood beside her. "He is teaching them their own history. It's written in the flow of the sea." Captain On smiled, a rare sight. "A ship needs a course," he said. "I think they are starting to chart one." The purpose they had needed was not given to them. It was uncovered, a shared treasure found in the meeting of two different kinds of knowledge. The Salem were no longer just surviving on Earth. They were beginning to communicate with it, and in doing so, they were reminding the humans beside them how to listen. The knowledge exchange was a small spark. But the wind was right, and that spark caught fire. What began in Busan as a series of conversations over sand drawings and tablet screens began to spread, carried on the digital winds of Jinho's now official global network. The story was no longer about a crisis. It was about discovery. In Chile, farmers struggling with drought worked with a group of Salem who had settled on the rocky coast. The Salem did not know about sprinklers or drip lines, but they understood moisture. They showed the farmers how to bury porous stones in specific, radiating patterns around the roots of crops. The stones, they mimed, would drink the cold night air and weep slowly into the soil during the day. The farmers, desperate, tried it. The water usage in the test fields dropped by half. The plants thrived. In the Netherlands, engineers battling rising sea levels brought Salem advisors to inspect their massive dikes and barriers. The Salem walked the structures, their hands sometimes resting on the concrete. They became visibly agitated near one particular section. Through translators, they insisted the water was singing a wrong song deep below. Sensors were deployed. They found a previously undetected pattern of erosion, a hidden weakness that could have led to a catastrophic failure in the next major storm. The repair was made. The Salem were not just giving answers. They were offering a new way to see the world. Humans saw water as a resource to be controlled. The Salem saw it as a partner to be understood. Their science was not built on equations first, but on observation and feel. It was a living science. Back in Busan, the exchange became a real economy. Jinho's Reciprocal Integration Initiative provided microloans. A group of Salem, using their understanding of polymer bonds from their lost world, began working with a local plastics engineer. They weren't making new plastic. They were breaking down the old. They developed a simple organic catalyst derived from a modified kelp enzyme that caused certain plastics to dissolve harmlessly into a non-toxic gel. It was a slow process, not a magic fix, but it worked on the mountains of fishing nets and waste that clogged the harbor. The resulting gel, they found, was a perfect nutrient-rich medium for growing more kelp. The small business that formed Ocean Harmony Solutions had a mixed workforce. Humans handled machinery and logistics. The Salem managed the enzyme cultures and quality control. They started cleaning the local beaches, then were hired by neighboring towns. They were earning money. They were paying taxes. They were solving a human problem no one else had been able to crack. Sumin watched as teachers stood proudly in the small open-air factory, overseeing the process. The hollow look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a focused light. He was not a refugee here. He was a foreman, a scientist, a teacher. The children of both species were the quickest to adapt. A shared playground emerged on the beach. Human children built sandcastles. Salem children sculpted complex, flowing water channels around them. Together, they created elaborate, doomed structures that the tide would eventually reclaim, laughing as the water fulfilled its purpose. They invented a hybrid ball game played in the shallow surf, with rules that made no sense to pure land or water dwellers, but perfect sense to them. Not everyone was happy. There were still protests. Some people saw the Salem-owned businesses as unfair competition. Others feared their different ways. News reports showed angry faces shouting about jobs and culture. But for every protester, there was now a farmer with a saved crop, an engineer with a safer dike, or a fisherman whose waters were suddenly cleaner. Jinho presented the data to the United Earth Council. He showed graphs not of costs, but of benefits. Increased agricultural yields in partnered regions. Improved disaster prevention metrics. New patents for bioremediation and water-efficient technologies, filed jointly by human and Salem teams. The economic output of the Busan zone, once a drain, was now in the green, fueled by small, innovative hybrid businesses. Compassion was the first step, Jinho told the assembled leaders, his voice calm but firm. It was the right step, but it was not the last step. The Salem are not a burden we carry. They are partners who lift with us. Their retribution was meant to break our world. Instead, they are helping us fix parts of it we didn't even know were broken. The overseer's cruel gift had been a stone of despair. Humanity, guided by that first instinct of compassion, had refused to throw it back. They had not simply carried its weight. They had learned to sculpt with it. The path of shared breath and shared water was building something new. Not a perfect world, but a mended one, stronger at its broken places. The Salem were no longer 6 million problems. They were 6 million potential teachers, healers, and friends. And Earth was finally ready to learn. 5 Earth years passed. The shape of the world had changed, subtly but surely, along its coastlines. In places like Busan, the change was not subtle at all. The makeshift camp of tents and container pools was gone. In its place stood a low-rise, open-air district designed with flowing lines and integrated water channels. Buildings had shallow, reflecting pools on their roofs and terraces, serving as both climate control for Salem residents and peaceful gathering spots for everyone. It was a fusion of human architecture and Salem sensibility, built by mixed crews using Salem-inspired water-efficient concrete and local materials. The harbor was cleaner than it had been in a century. The small Ocean Harmony Solutions factory was now a thriving industrial cooperative, its organic catalyst sold to coastal cities worldwide. The kelp farms, designed with Salem patterns, were abundant food sources and carbon sinks. The air smelled of salt and possibility, not decay. Jinho now had an office with a window, overlooking a park in Geneva. His title was longer, but his work was the same, building bridges. He reviewed a final report before the day's big meeting. The global Salem population was stable, healthy, and increasingly integrated. Over 60% were in some form of education or skilled employment. They were weavers, water system consultants, composers of music based on tidal patterns, and chefs creating new cuisine from kelp and sustainable seafood. The meeting was with the Planetary Defense Council. The topic was no longer about refugee aid. It was about the long-range sensors that had, an hour before, detected a familiar energy signature at the edge of the solar system. The hegemony was returning. A cold silence filled the room. The old fears rushed back. Was this another delivery? An invasion to finish the job? The military advisors spoke of defense grids and mobilization. Jinho listened, then stood. "We will follow the protocol we established," he said. His voice was calm. The protocol was his idea. It was not a military plan. It was a simple instruction: show them everything. When the hegemony ship, the same monolithic vessel, took up position in high orbit, the transmission came exactly as before. The face of the overseer appeared on screens across the planet. The gray, slate-like eyes held the same cold indifference. "People of Earth, we have returned to observe the consequences of your compassion." The word was a sneer. "Prepare to submit your failure metrics for galactic record." Jinho, as the appointed planetary liaison, appeared on the feed. He was not in a bunker. He was in his sunlit office, a living green wall behind him. "Overseer, we welcome your observation. We are transmitting our planetary data packets now." What flooded to the hegemony ship was not a plea or a report of collapse. It was a torrent of information. Economic growth charts from integrated zones. Environmental recovery indices showing cleaner oceans and restored coastal ecosystems. Cultural databases filled with Salem human collaborative art, music, and literature. Medical journals detailing joint research on cellular hydration that was advancing human gerontology. Architectural designs for flood-resistant cities. For a long moment, the overseer was silent, his eyes flickering as he processed the data. The cold certainty on his face began to crack, replaced by a slow-dawning confusion. This was not the data of a broken world. You industrialized their labor?" The overseer finally said, his tone searching for an explanation that fit his worldview. "You enslaved them for efficiency?" From a split-screen feed, another face appeared. It was Teacher. He was in the Busan District Hall, standing beside Sumin. He wore a simple, well-made tunic. His large eyes were calm and clear. Speaking through a translator, his voice was firm. "They did not industrialize us. They listened to us." Teacher looked at Sumin, who gave him a slight nod of encouragement. You sought to break two species with the weight of your cruelty. You gave us only despair. They saw our despair and offered a shared breath. They asked us not what we needed, but what we knew. The overseer stared. Your knowledge is the property of the hegemony. It is forbidden to disperse it to primitives. Your cruelty is simple. It is a dead end. Teacher continued, his words measured. Compassion is harder. It is a path. You dropped us into an ocean of sorrow. These people did not let us drown. They did not climb onto the shore and watch us sink. They swam out to meet us. And together, we are building a new shore. On the screen, Jin-Ho added the final piece. He pulled up a simple graph. It showed two lines. One was the projected economic and resource cost of supporting 6 million refugees, based on the overseer's original assumptions. The line plunged steeply downward, a prediction of ruin. The other line was the actual outcome. After an initial dip, it rose steadily upward, surpassing Earth's original baseline. The two lines formed a sharp, undeniable X on the chart. You mistook compassion for weakness, Jin-Ho said, his gaze steady on the overseer's image. It is not. It is a different kind of strength. You gave us 6 million souls. We gained colleagues, inventors, teachers, and friends. Your retribution was our unexpected gift. The record is complete. The transmission from the hegemony ship cut off abruptly. No farewell, no threat, just a stunned silence. On Earth, there was no cheering. In Busan, Sumin put a hand on teacher's shoulder. In Geneva, Jin-Ho slowly sat down, letting out a breath he felt he had been holding for 5 years. They had not won a war. They had simply presented a receipt for a transaction the hegemony could not comprehend. They had proven that the harder path was not just morally right, but strategically superior. The silence from the stars was the sound of a cruel, simple idea shattering against a complex, mended reality. The hegemony ship left. It turned silently in the void and slipped back into the rippling fracture of faster-than-light space, leaving no message, no threat, no apology. Its departure was as cold and unexplained as its arrival had been. On Earth, people waited for the other shoe to drop. For a week, then a month, the world held a collective breath. Military alerts remained at a cautious level. News analysts debated the meaning of the silent retreat. But in places like Busan, life did not stop. Couldn't. The kelp needed harvesting. The water filters needed maintenance. The children needed to get to school. The sheer normalcy of the work, the daily rhythm of a shared life, became the planet's real answer. The silence from the stars was met with the sounds of a living world. The chatter of a marketplace, the splash of water in a communal pool, the laughter from a playground. Jin-Ho returned to Busan for the first time since the crisis began. He walked through the integrated district not as a bureaucrat on an inspection, but as a visitor. He saw a Salem artisan selling delicate wind chimes made from shaped glass and sea-polished stone, their tones mimicking the sound of waves over rocks. A human cafe next door served tea and a sweet, green kelp paste bun that had become a local favorite. He found Sumin and Captain On at the original pier, now expanded into a broad public plaza. Captain On, officially retired but eternally present, was pointing out to sea, explaining an incoming weather pattern to a young Salem dock worker. Sumin was reviewing plans on a tablet for a new community center, one with a roof designed to collect rainwater in a spiral pattern. It's strange, Sumin said to Jin-Ho, setting her tablet down. For years, we worked thinking they might come back, thinking we had to prove something. Now that they're gone, the work is just the work. It's for us now. Jin-Ho nodded. That was the final truth. The overseer's punishment had forced a choice. Humanity's choice had created a new reality. That reality no longer needed the overseer to define it. It was its own thing. Later, he walked with teacher in a garden park where land plants and water plants were woven together. What do you think they learned? Jin-Ho asked. Teacher was quiet for a time, his webbed fingers brushing the leaves of a terrestrial fern. I do not think they learned about compassion, he said finally. I think they learned about failure. Their tool did not work. A hammer that does not break the stone is a useless weight. They have gone to put their hammer away. He looked at Jin-ho, his dark eyes peaceful. Our lesson was different. We learned a new way to build. The true monument was not a statue or a grand building. It was in the small, ordinary details of a fused life. In the hybrid school curriculum that taught human history alongside Salem tidal lore. In the joint marine research vessels where human oceanographers and Salem observers mapped the deep currents together. In the simple, unremarkable fact that a human child could name a Salem friend, and a Salem elder could scold a human teenager for running by the pools, and it was all just part of the neighborhood. The story of the 6 million refugees did not have a dramatic, galactic ending. It had a quiet, human one. It ended with a family moving into a new home. It ended with a business turning a profit. It ended with an old fisherman and a Salem historian sharing a meal, struggling to communicate but sharing the fish all the same on the beach, under the same sun that had watched their desperate arrival years before. Jin-ho stood with Su-min and teacher. They watched the children play the complicated ball game in the surf. The rules were still nonsense to any adult. A joyous chaos of splashing and shouting and different kinds of laughter that Su-min smiled. They don't even remember a time before, she said. That was the final victory. Not over the hegemony, but over despair itself. The past was not forgotten. The loss of the Salem homeworld was a permanent scar, and the memory of the day the sky torn was etched into human history. But it was not the only story anymore. Now, there was also the story of the Busan Protocol, of the life water, of the kelp farms and the plastic-eating enzymes. The story of the shared breath. The path of cruelty had been a simple, dead-end road. They had chosen the harder path, overgrown and uncertain. And in walking it, step by difficult step, they had not been broken. They had been remade. The tide came in, as it always did, washing over the intricate sandcastles and water channels the children had built. It did not destroy their work. It completed it, smoothing the edges and carrying the memory of their play out into the deep, endless sea.